Okay, well, here we are in our last lesson from the book of Genesis for our Connect Group quarter. Just a reminder, your new materials are in your boxes in the parlor, so please pick them up this week if you haven't already. And if you right away notice any problems, let us know, although what we gave you is what you asked for, so make sure you're accurate when we give you those requests. Notice the different changes in your group attendance and so forth. So we're in Genesis chapter 50, and the passage is from chapter, not looking at the lesson book at the moment, but basically chapters, chapters, verses 15 through 26. So just like last week, you have a challenge because your last lesson was from chapter 45. So you have 5 chapters in between. And there are just a few things that you might want to mention to kind of keep everybody's brain working in proper context. But before we do that, I just want to mention a theme. I see the theme here as being forgiveness and really the 2 sides of forgiveness. So there are 2 sides of forgiveness. There's the incredible example of Joseph, who forgives his brothers despite the terrible way in which they treated him. But then there's also now what we see is the challenge for people to accept forgiveness, to truly believe they're forgiven. And that is what Joseph's brothers do not believe, as they come to him now, their father having just died. Now, with that in mind, that's the first major context issue I think you need to establish. Jacob lives for 17 years in Egypt, according to chapter 47, verse 28. His death is actually recorded in chapter 49, verse 33. So these brothers have been living in Egypt with Jacob and with Joseph, providing for them for 17 years. There's no reason to think in those 17 years that Jacob doubted Joseph's sincerity, which is going to be important to this passage, or that Joseph gave his brothers any reason to doubt it. So then there's, alongside with Jacob's death, is his request for his body to be taken back to Canaan, to be buried in the land of promise. And so Genesis 50, verses 7 through 11, right before your text, gives the account of that. And it's really interesting because let me just read verse 7 and verse 11 as it demonstrates the tremendous respect that Jacob had from the people of Egypt. He's basically given a funeral procession of honors as an Egyptian, as an important Egyptian. Notice verse 7, and Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. And then verse 11 says, when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians, wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. So they saw this as a significant, these other people saw this as a significant person in Egypt to have that kind of mourning taking place from these leaders, these Egyptian leaders. Verses 15 through 17, we get into the text, and it demonstrates the brothers' inability to believe in Joseph's sincerity and forgiveness, despite, as I said, how he's been treating them for 17 years. Many believe, and I think with good reason, that their claim that Jacob told them or commanded them to go to Joseph and beg Joseph to forgive them, as if, in other words, they go and say, Jacob, our dad has told us to tell you this, you need to forgive us, etc., as if it's from him. Many believe that that is something they made up, and I believe that's probably a strong possibility because, first of all, Joseph has never given Jacob any reason to not believe him. He's an honest, straight-up, God-fearing man who has demonstrated his love and his kindness to them for the last 17 years. His brothers, however, are not honest men. And so in their concern and fear, it's very more like their character to make up the story to try to secure this forgiveness that they don't believe Joseph has really given them. So a good application here would be, do you struggle to believe you're forgiven when you wrong somebody and they say they forgive you? Or do you struggle to believe that God has forgiven you? You believe you're saved, you died on the cross for your sins, but you still struggle sometimes to believe he's forgiven you of all trespasses. And so Joseph's brothers struggle to believe in the grace or / forgiveness of Joseph is an interesting illustration of the kind of mistrust people have towards God's grace. In other words, if they doubt, if they believe they can lose their salvation, isn't that the same thing? Isn't that struggling to believe that God has truly forgiven you, or that maybe his forgiveness is only temporary, that doesn't cover everything? I mean, when you think about it, the doctrine of losing your salvation is a very serious, I can't think of the word I want, but insult, I guess, to the atonement of Christ, to the full atonement of Christ. It really is an unbelief in the full atonement of Christ. So it very much concerns me that some who hold that position maybe don't really understand salvation to the point where maybe they're not forgiven at all. I'm not saying that there aren't true Christians that don't believe you can lose your salvation. I'm saying it's a problematic doctrine. So one person has said this: God's forgiveness has nothing to do with the size of the sinner's mischief, but with the size of the Savior's mercy, which of course the Bible clearly tells us is everlasting. The brothers' mistake was to judge Joseph's forgiveness by their guile, not by his grace. And in verse 18, once again, as they come to Joseph and they're afraid for their lives, we see them bowing again to Joseph. Just the scripture keeps emphasizing the fulfillment of that dream that Joseph had. Joseph's threefold response in this passage really demonstrates the Christ-like spirit of forgiveness that we see even in the New Testament. For example, Joseph's response tells us, basically states three things. Number one, we're to leave vengeance or all righting of what is wrong to God. Joseph says to them, do not be afraid, verse 19, for am I in God's place? In other words, do I have the right to take God's rightful place as being the judge? Romans 12:19 talks about vengeance belonging to the Lord. So there's that New Testament connection to what Joseph is saying. Number two, to trust God's sovereign providence over man's actions, including evil ones. Genesis 50, verse 20, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. So as I emphasized last week when I taught the lesson last week, and no doubt emphasized in the video, God's sovereignty, Joseph's belief in that was how he was able to have a forgiving spirit, and that truth reflects Romans 8:28, among other scriptures, that God works all things together for good. Third, we are to love our enemies and repay evil with forgiving grace. Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28. But I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. So Joseph's response to his brothers again reflects the godliness that he had in how he dealt with this situation. Then we see that Joseph in verse 24 through 26 has the same dying request, or a similar dying request, I should say, as his dad. He doesn't want to be buried in the promised land yet, and there's a lot of conjecture as to why. But his total faith in God's promise to Abraham and Jacob's reiteration of that promise in chapter 48:21, where Jacob says, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. So he fully believes, Jacob fully believed and communicated to Joseph that, and his sons, that God is going to bring them out of Egypt someday and back to the land of promise. And so Joseph, in his belief of that, gives instructions for his bones to be taken back to the land of promise when that happens, when Israel comes out of Egypt. Verse 24, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So even in that statement, Joseph indicates that it would take a while. It's still going to be down the road quite a ways before that happens, because they're not going to be taking his body. They're just going to be taking his bones. And amazingly, we see the faith and the communication of truth actually down through the years, because it's 400 years later, 400 years plus later, when Moses leads Israel out. And when he does, notice what Exodus 13:19 says, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones away hence with you. And then 40 years of wandering, then Joshua goes in and starts leading the conquest. And notice what Joshua 24:32 says, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. It became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. So lots of faith all over this passage. In fact, I didn't include this in my notes, but Hebrews chapter 11, which is the faith chapter, talks about various examples of faith. When it talks about Joseph, with all the things he did for God that manifested faith, what it records in Hebrews 11 as a demonstration of his faith is this order to carry his bones up out of Egypt. Why? What was so big deal about that? Well, it's a big deal because it's his complete faith in God's promise of the Abrahamic covenant. So just a good ending to this great book of the Bible, this foundational book of the Bible. I hope you've enjoyed teaching it, and then we will start working on the book of Acts. And so again, remember to get your material, and look forward to discussing that book with you in the near future. Have a great weekend.